Europe is in full panic mode, and what triggered it will leave you absolutely speechless. The entire European security framework that has existed since World War II is collapsing in real time. And Donald Trump just forced Europe to confront a terrifying reality they've been avoiding for decades. America is no longer their protector. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio just delivered a speech in Munich that sent shockwaves through European capitals. U.S. Undersecretary of Defense Elbridge Colby told NATO defense ministers point blank, "Europe is no longer a U.S. priority. The Indo-Pacific is. America is reducing its military presence in Europe. Europe needs to become a partner instead of a dependent." And here's the part that changes everything. Trump threatened Danish sovereignty over Greenland. He refused to rule out taking the island by force. He temporarily paused intelligence sharing with Ukrainian forces, leaving them blind on the battlefield, just to pressure them into peace talks with Russia. He slapped tariffs on European exports. He told European nations the U.S. won't protect them if they don't pay for their own defense. Denmark's prime minister stood on stage in Munich, still visibly furious about the Greenland crisis. Germany's defense minister admitted, "We got used to our comfort zone. This time is over, definitely over." The president of the European Commission said, "Some lines have been crossed that cannot be uncrossed anymore. Europeans have suffered shock therapy." This isn't diplomatic disagreement. This is the complete breakdown of the transatlantic alliance that has defined Western civilization for 80 years. And Europe is scrambling to figure out what comes next. When you understand what's actually happening in Europe right now, why Trump's threats have created existential panic, and what this means for the entire global order, you'll realize we're witnessing the most significant geopolitical realignment since the end of the Cold War. Let me walk you through exactly what Trump has done, how Europe is responding, and why the world you grew up in no longer exists. Let's start in Munich, because what just happened at the Munich Security Conference reveals everything you need to know about where Europe-US relations stand. The Munich Security Conference is the world's biggest annual defense meeting. Leaders, security experts, defense industries, all gathered in one place to discuss the biggest threats facing the Western alliance. This year's conference was dominated by one question: can Europe still count on America? The most anticipated speech was from Marco Rubio, representing the Trump administration. European leaders were literally on the edge of their seats, not because they expected good news, because they were terrified of what he might say. Think about that. America's closest allies were afraid of what the U.S. Secretary of State would say to them. That's how bad things have gotten. Rubio's speech included warm words about historic kinship and shared destiny. "We want Europe to be strong," he said. "The two great wars of the last century serve as a constant reminder that ultimately our destiny is, and will always be, intertwined with yours." European leaders jumped to their feet, applauding. They were clearly relieved he hadn't threatened or berated them like Vice President J.D. Vance did at last year's conference. But one European diplomat described Rubio's speech as psychological abuse. He reminded Europe how wonderful the relationship used to be, but then switched to coercion. "If you want things to be good between us in the future, you have to do as I say." Because beneath the warm words was a brutal message. America's partnership with Europe is conditional. There will be no compromise. Europe either shares Trump's values and priorities, or America walks away. And what are those values? Anti-climate action, skeptical of globalization and multilateralism, anti-migration, pro-building a new era of Christian Western civilization. If Europe wants American protection, they have to adopt Trump's worldview. Not negotiate, not compromise, submit. And just to drive the point home, after giving his speech in Germany, Rubio chose to visit Slovakia and Hungary before returning to the U.S. Both countries are viewed by Brussels as problematic EU members, with Eurosceptic nationalist prime ministers who oppose aid to Ukraine and push hardline anti-migration policies. The symbolism was clear. America prefers European countries that align with Trump's nationalism over traditional allies committed to liberal democratic values. Then came Elbridge Colby's message to NATO defense ministers in Brussels, even more brutal than Rubio's conditional partnership. Under President Trump's leadership, we are reprioritizing the defense of our homeland and the protection of our interests in our hemisphere. Europe is no longer a U.S. priority. The Indo-Pacific is. He said America would reduce its military capabilities in Europe, becoming a more limited and focused presence. Europe had to become a partner rather than a dependent. This is the death of the transatlantic security relationship as it has existed since 1945. America is openly telling Europe, "You're on your own. We're pivoting to Asia. Deal with Russia yourselves." Now let's talk about Greenland, because this crisis revealed just how far Trump is willing to go. Trump has repeatedly stated his desire to acquire Greenland, which is a self-governing territory of Denmark. He's called it a strategic necessity for American security. In January, Trump refused to rule out taking Greenland by military force. Think about what that means: an American president threatening military action against a NATO ally to seize their territory. He also threatened economic sanctions against the UK, France, and Germany if they interfered with American efforts to acquire Greenland. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said at the Munich conference that Trump's designs on Greenland remain the same, despite ongoing talks. Trump has backed away from threatening military force for now, but the damage to transatlantic trust is permanent. One European diplomat said it perfectly: "Some lines have been crossed that cannot be uncrossed anymore." When an American president threatens to invade a NATO ally's territory, the entire security framework collapses. Because NATO's core principle is collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. But what happens when the potential attacker is the United States itself? What happens when the country that's supposed to guarantee European security is threatening European sovereignty? The whole system breaks down, and Europeans are realizing they can't count on American protection anymore. Not when America might be the threat. Let's talk about Ukraine, because Trump's actions there reveal just how transactional and unreliable American security commitments have become. In March 2025, the Trump administration temporarily paused intelligence sharing with Ukrainian forces. This left Ukrainian troops blind on the battlefield, unable to see Russian troop movements or incoming attacks. Why did Trump do this? To pressure Kiev into engaging in peace talks with Moscow on terms favorable to Russia. American intelligence was being used as a bargaining chip. Ukrainian soldiers were dying because Trump wanted leverage in negotiations, and Europe watched helplessly as America abandoned Ukraine to force a deal. Then Trump halted all new direct military aid to Ukraine. Germany is now the single largest donor of military aid to Ukraine, not because Germany wanted that role, because America walked away. This showed Europe that American security commitments are conditional and can be revoked at any moment for domestic political reasons. Treaties don't matter. Alliances don't matter. Only Trump's immediate political goals matter. If America can abandon Ukraine this way, Europe realizes it can abandon anyone, including NATO allies. Now let's talk about what Europe is actually doing in response, because the changes happening are massive. Germany's defense budget will be higher than the UK and French budgets combined by 2029. They're spending $150 billion on defense. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called it a staggering amount. But it's not just Germany. Defense spending is surging across Europe. Countries are scrambling to build capabilities they relied on America for. Advanced weapons systems, intelligence infrastructure, command and control systems. Munich streets are covered with posters advertising next-generation drones. Europe's security under construction, the slogans say. This kind of public military advertising would have been unthinkable in Germany just a few years ago. Germany's Federal Office of Civil Protection warned for the first time since the Cold War that war is no longer unlikely. They're recommending Germans keep food supplies for 3 to 10 days at home, just in case. Think about what that means. Germany is preparing its civilian population for the possibility of war in Europe. That's not hypothetical planning. That's real preparation based on genuine threat assessment. According to Eurobarometer polling, more than 2/3 of Europeans feel their country is under threat. They're squeezed between an expansionist Russia to the east, an economically aggressive China, and an increasingly unpredictable former ally, the United States, to the west. Europe is realizing it's alone. Genuinely alone for the first time since 1945. But here's where it gets complicated. Not all European countries are responding the same way. Rachel Ellahus from defense think tank RUSI describes a rift opening across Europe. Nordic and Baltic countries close to Russia, plus Germany and the Netherlands, are massively increasing defense spending. They take the threat seriously. But southern European countries like Spain are refusing to increase defense budgets to the levels Trump demands. France and Britain are verbally committed, but still looking for ways to explain to voters why they need higher taxes, less welfare, or more borrowing to pay for defense. This creates a huge problem. If some European countries dramatically increase defense spending while others don't, Europe can't present a unified deterrent to Russia. The alliance fractures along lines of commitment. Ellahus says Europeans have 5 to 10 years to stand on their own feet in terms of conventional defense capabilities. That's not a long time to build what America provided for 80 years. Can Europe actually do it? Can they develop the military capabilities to deter Russia without American support? The honest answer is nobody knows. Europe has massive economic power, but has relied on America for military protection for so long that their defense industries atrophied. They don't have the production capacity to quickly build what they need, and they certainly don't have America's high-tech military innovation. This weekend's conference was a reminder of just how dependent Europe remains on U.S. security support, the nuclear umbrella, intelligence sharing, command and control structures, high-tech weapon systems. Europe trails America dramatically in all of these areas. Building European military independence isn't just about money. It's about technology, industrial capacity, and strategic culture, all of which take decades to develop. Now let's talk about the ad hoc coalitions Europe is forming, because this reveals their strategy for the New World Order. Traditional organizations like NATO and the EU are large and slow to react. So European leaders are increasingly turning to smaller, more nimble coalitions that can move faster. The UK and France lead a coalition of the willing, focused on securing Ukrainian sovereignty in any peace deal with Russia. Turkey, New Zealand, and Australia attend these meetings. Non-European countries joining European security initiatives. Canada is working closely with Nordic and Baltic nations on shared Arctic security challenges. One European policymaker joked that Canada is becoming more and more European by the day. Japan and South Korea are increasingly seen as part of the like-minded family of nations sharing democratic values and security concerns. These coalitions go beyond just defense. France's President Macron calls for European strategic autonomy in energy security, supply chains, and new technologies. He recommended Europe de-risk from all outside powers. Even the president of the European Commission admitted that if the EU can't move fast enough on improving competitiveness, a group of its member states would have to move forward alone. This is a fundamental shift. For 80 years, European security was built on formal alliances, primarily NATO. Now Europe is building flexible coalitions with whoever shares their immediate interests and values. It's a much more fragile system. Ad hoc coalitions can dissolve when interests diverge. They don't have the institutional weight and treaty obligations of NATO. But Europe doesn't have a choice. If America won't commit to European security unconditionally, Europe has to build new structures with partners who will. Britain's approach reveals the complexity of this transition. Prime Minister Keir Starmer spoke in Munich about greater UK-Europe integration on defense to cut costs, but he emphasized Britain isn't turning its back on America. Sophia Gaston from King's College London says Britain faces hard choices triangulating between Europe and America. Britain has typically pursued diplomacy in elegant, consensus-focused, and invisible ways, but the New World requires a much more competitive approach. Britain can't afford to fully align with either Europe or America. They need to maintain relationships with both while protecting British interests, even when those interests diverge from allies. This is the new reality for all European countries, maintaining multiple overlapping relationships with different partners for different purposes, much more complex than the simple Cold War framework where America led and Europe followed. Now let's talk about what this means for Russia, because European weakness creates massive opportunities for Putin. Russia is watching Europe struggle to build defense capabilities while America pivots to Asia. Putin sees a window of opportunity before Europe gets strong enough to deter Russian aggression. If Putin is going to expand Russian territory beyond Ukraine, now is the time. Before European rearmament is complete, before new defense industrial capacity comes online, before European coalitions solidify into reliable deterrence, the next 5 to 10 years are extremely dangerous. Europe is vulnerable, America is distracted, Russia is aggressive. That's a recipe for conflict. And Europe knows it. That's why Germany is telling citizens to stockpile food. That's why defense budgets are surging. That's why every European security conference is dominated by urgency and fear. The comfortable post-Cold War assumption that major war in Europe is impossible has completely evaporated. European leaders now view war as a realistic possibility they must prepare for. Let's talk about what this means for China, because the European situation directly affects the Indo-Pacific. America is pivoting to Asia specifically to counter China. That's why Colby said Europe is no longer the priority. American military resources are being redirected to prepare for potential conflict with China over Taiwan. But if Europe can't defend itself, America might get pulled back into European conflicts regardless of its Indo-Pacific focus. American strategy depends on Europe being stable and secure without American military presence. If Europe remains weak and Russia continues expanding, America faces an impossible choice: abandon Europe entirely or get dragged back into European security despite wanting to focus on China. China is watching this very carefully. If America gets tied down managing European security, that reduces American capacity to project power in the Pacific. That gives China more freedom to act against Taiwan or other regional targets. So the stability of the entire global order depends on whether Europe can successfully build independent defense capabilities in the next 5 to 10 years. If they can, America can focus on China and the global balance holds. If they can't, the entire Western alliance structure collapses, and we enter a much more dangerous multipolar world. Here's the bottom line, and why this matters more than almost any other story happening right now. The transatlantic alliance that defined Western civilization since 1945 is over. Donald Trump has made absolutely clear that American security commitments to Europe are conditional, transactional, and can be revoked at any moment. Europe is scrambling to build independent defense capabilities before Russia exploits their vulnerability. They're forming ad hoc coalitions with non-European democracies. They're dramatically increasing defense spending. They're preparing civilian populations for possible war. But they're also deeply divided between countries that take the threat seriously and countries that don't want to pay for defense. They're decades behind America in military technology. And they're running out of time. The next 5 to 10 years will determine whether Europe can stand on its own or whether European weakness creates global instability that pulls America back, and despite its desire to pivot to Asia. Marco Rubio called for a new century of Western civilization. But that Western civilization won't be led by America the way it was for 80 years. It will be a much more fragmented, competitive, unstable arrangement where Europe has to fend for itself. The comfortable world where America guaranteed European security is gone. Europeans have suffered shock therapy. Some lines have been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. Welcome to Trump's new world order. Europe is having to adjust fast, and nobody knows if they'll adjust fast enough to prevent the catastrophe everyone sees coming.